Dear guests, to understand contemporary security problems and changes in the international system, it's important to understand as many takes and perspectives as possible. And Russian perspective is no exception here, given the war in Ukraine. However, by Russian perspective, I do not necessarily mean Russian official state perspective. What I mean by Russian perspective is the myriads of ways to look at this conflict through the lenses of Russian people, of Russian citizens. And depending on where they stand and where they live, they can have drastically different takes on this conflict, from supportive to opposing to utterly cynical, and so on and so forth. And it's also important to understand that those perspectives are fluid, uncertain, and constantly changing. So keeping this in mind, I want to introduce you this conversation with Vava that we recorded in December 2022, so around 3 months ago, where we try to disentangle a little bit my personal reflections on Russia, maybe previous experiences in and with Russia, and different aspects of Russian history, culture, and so on and so forth. I think it turned out to be a very interesting conversation that first and foremost reveals the whole complexity of the issue. I don't think it gives any certain answers. Again, it points to the complexity of Russia and of feelings that one can have connected to Russia in this or that way, and I guess opens a difficult but necessary reflective mechanism to understand better Russian society and the future of Russia. So if you like the podcast, please share with your friends, and as always, enjoy.
So I guess my first question, or actually two questions to you, would be, what did it mean to be Russian before February 24th, 2022? And what does it mean to be Russian right now?
Okay.
Do you think there has been a difference? Was it clear actually before what did it mean to be Russian? Is it clear now? What changed?
That's a hard one.
I know. I decided to start with the heavy guns.
Yes, but we don't choose the easy path. Interesting one. Yeah, I think, of course, like being Russian is deeply connected to speaking Russian language. I feel so. I mean, I was raised in Russia, so it's easier for me to say what does it mean to be Russian from this perspective, because I also have Russian passport.
Yeah.
It's also, you need to be like very material, because like those things, they define you more than you think. I mean, if something happens, like, I could be deported to Russia, or I mean, if, like Germany can just simply cancel my residence permit, so to say, with no good reason, and the only country I could really go is Russia.
Maybe Belarus as well.
Maybe Belarus as well, or Kazakhstan. But it's still like, you go with a Russian passport, so to speak. So I would go with a very lame answer. Maybe having Russian passport means that you're Russian. But it's a lame one. Of course, this
is I guess something that comes down even to the Russian language, which is I guess hard to translate into English. In Russian, you have the differentiation between Русский and Российский. So one which is basically ethnically Russian, and one which is someone belonging to like the broader Russian state.
Yes.
I've seen a nice analogy to the differences between English and British.
Okay.
So English is ethnically English, and British is belonging to the British Empire. Or Great Britain, basically. So I guess maybe the difference between Ruski and Российский is sort of the same. And I wonder if these differences are more pronounced now than they were before. Are people who are not Ruski, are they still Российский? I wonder.
Yeah, but I guess like as you suggested, there was a shift on February 24th when, of course, the war started, because then it completely changes your perception of this world, especially your perception of European security or your perception of European politics, because I guess it forces you to pick sides. Like before, pre-war, you were quite comfortable in maintaining this position that, yes, I mean, I don't support Putin personally, but it's not that I'm anti-Russian, or like, all those liberals who say, yeah, like, let's topple Putin, have a revolution, and then what? Like, I'm, for example, I always kind of oppose this because I don't see anything good coming out of this. But after the war, it's tricky now, because it's almost like the whole situation pushes you to pick sides, and situation both in Russia domestically and outside Russia, when people punish you just for being Russian in many different small kind of ways. So I mean, I would still go that I'm just Russian first of all, because I still have a Russian citizenship, and I don't have any other citizenship yet. Yet, the key phrase here. But yeah, I would say, and also because I still feel I belong to this country, belong to the people who live like there, and I still spend most of my time in Russia. So I think I'll just go with saying, yes, there is a difference, and this difference exactly in this fact that you have to pick sides. You're either, there's nothing in between. So you're either Russian and you just support the war, even not maybe actively, but in a sense you still understand that this is like your, kind of like brothers fighting in this war, almost citizens of your country, or you don't support, and then you kind of become immediately anti-Russian.
Yeah, so you're either with us or against us.
Yes, which is a very tricky bit, but I don't think it's just Putin is doing this or just Russia is doing this. It's also people in the West doing this. Because of course, there are so many stories that in Czech universities, or in Polish universities or Latvian universities, or what have you, they force students to sign this petition against the war, or they force them to say publicly that they are against the war, which is obnoxious a little bit, because those are free people, and if they are already abroad, it means something in terms of they are anti-Putin most likely. So why do you push them to pick sides?
Do you think that most of Russian immigrants are anti-Putin?
Yeah, that's why they leave.
Okay.
Because they all, I would say they all have material capacity to leave, so they have money. And they make this conscious decision, so and living is always very much more difficult than staying, obviously, because you invest so much resources, you invest your kind of mental capacity.
Yes, true.
And it's always harder to leave than stay. But if those people were just satisfied in the country, for example, if I was satisfied with developments in Russia, I would just stay. I don't think I would just leave the country for no good reason.
Yeah, so. That makes perfect sense. So let's go back exactly to the time before you left.
Yes.
We already talked about this a little bit before. So let's go back to the period in your life where you slowly became aware of political events. When we were kids, roughly when you're a teenager, you start following news and you start slowly knowing, okay, there's this party and there's these guys, these politicians. So back in the day when you first became politically aware, what did you think of Russia and Russian politics? What was your take on it?
Yes, I think I was very politically active since early childhood, since 12 years old or 14 years old. I'm a kid of zeros, so to say. I was growing in zeros, and the whole situation was in Russia pretty liberal. I think I can say with a certainty that Russia back then was a liberal country. In not a liberal in some utopic sense. Of course, there were problems, there was corruption, there were killings of journalists, all of this stuff, and slowly country was becoming authoritarian. But by and large, in terms of I never experienced teachers telling me, oh, you're not allowed to say this or that. We could discuss everything in class, we could discuss everything outside class. People took drugs, whatever you think about, completely Western type of experience, in a sense of very free, just free or free from any interference of any authority, so to speak. And that was my kind of experience in the early childhood. And of course, like I remember having like a very fierce debates with my. I actually had a party back in the day, even organized like nationalist party in my school because I thought like, why don't the young people in Russia have a nationalist party, so to speak? I think it was like had like a fancy name, like something like a Nationalist Democratic Party of Russia or something.
Damn, sounds very serious.
Yeah, because I was reading a lot on basically the Russian Civil War and this period of time, like late Russian Empire, and to me it was fascinating, how many ideas back in the day were in Russian politics. And of course, Russia in 1905 or 1907, after like first revolution in Russia, it became kind of like this constitutional democracy and with the parliament, and like the number of parties actually were quite large.
Oh yeah.
I mean, they had like all sorts of, for every taste, so to speak. They were nationalists, Democrats, Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, everyone.
And then remember all of the different national minorities who were represented in the parliament, which were hundreds of them.
Yeah. So, I mean, I remember myself actually having debates about like, it's better to have Medvedev for the second term, for example, because he's a liberal and Putin is he's a conservative, so to speak. And I mean, that's my first memory is definitely all about like, being actively politically and having, I guess, good hopes because, I mean, as such, the country was booming, especially Moscow was definitely booming. And it felt like just you were living. I mean, everything was good. Just like it was like 8% GDP growth, even like I guess. And this is what made the whole situation pretty appealing to live there, and just like was very nice human experience, I guess.
And what did you think of Russia vis-a-vis the rest of the world? Did you think of Russia's position in the larger global system, or rather more with domestic politics?
Back in school, not really. I mainly read a lot on Russian history and Russian politics. I mean, you could say so in terms of historical political events. I was like very passionate for it. And I didn't really care about like international system. And I traveled a lot like a tourist, but I never like traveled like, to the conferences. I don't know, like an academic. I didn't really conceptualize myself. So I just read a lot on Russian history and politics, so therefore I was more or less active politically in terms of Russian, I would say domestic politics. I mean, which of course was already type of the parliament wasn't really real parliament. And it's also tricky to say because I guess people maybe in the West now have this conception that Putin came to power and he was already this evil type of guy with a lot of power. But I mean, actually, not really, because he didn't even have his own party back in the day. His party was formed only in 2002, which tells you something, because he didn't really have this authority, but he kind of step by step collected this power and assembled this power in Russia we say vertical of power, so to speak, step by step, and then he became like really powerful. And then, of course, there was a synergy of Russian people also saying, yeah, he's a good dude. Like, I remember actually my dad, I'm driving in his car in 2004, and there was like a first elections. Like in 2004, there was presidential elections, and I asked him, who did you vote for? He's like, of course, Putin. And he's so pro business, and he did this and that, and I don't pay as much taxes as I used to. Like, of course, I'm pro Putin. I was like, okay, cool. Yeah, so it didn't age well, of course.
yeah, things age differently.
Yeah.
So I guess you can call this period of time the liberal period in Russia. Would you say things changed in 2014?
I think they changed. It's common to say in 2012 with the protest and crackdown on protest and with Putin's re-election to a new term. Because, I mean, especially now, sometimes I think, well, but the whole Medvedev presidency is so interesting. Like, why did they even do this? Because, I mean, obviously Medvedev was liberal, he was openly Democrat, and he had all sorts of ideas about democracy. He gave interviews to Russian liberal news channels that are now basically closed, and he gave them interviews like freely, like in a sense without any preparation. So like in Western politics, so to speak, even not everyone in Western politics does this, so to speak. Not every politician in the West. So it's very interesting why for example, even Putin chose this type of development. Like some people, I mean, may argue that he wanted to show the West that, you know, you want like change of government, you want like Western type of system. Here you go. Yeah, and actually, the first international visit Medvedev made, I guess it was to the United States. There were like those famous scenes of them eating burgers with Obama and stuff like this. So he tried to reconcile, I guess. And then they had, of course, перезагрузка.
Перегрузка.
Yeah, перегрузка, I guess. It turned into перегрузка for sure.
Yeah, so for those unaware of what we're talking about is that Hillary Clinton met with Lavrov.
Yeah.
And they prepared like this button that was supposed to say reset.
Reset.
But they confused the words and they confused with overload or like overload of tension or something like this.
I mean, definitely turned into overload.
Yeah, so basically poor translation, but was very prophetic, I guess.
Well, American State Department, I guess. Lack of Russian experts. Maybe that tells you something about American foreign policy.
Exactly.
Like, as you said, I remember it was actually a very great phrase on our previous episode. Previously on, because you said like, yeah, Americans didn't care about the world because everyone wanted to become American, so why would you even, you know, care about like other cultures and other ways of thinking if everyone wants to become you, so to speak. There was like this hubris of basically American arrogance and and it's just interesting for me also to think now, like, and of course events changed in 2012. There were like protests, like very, very big protests, and they didn't really end up well. I mean, some of my actually friends from school, they went to this protest, and my parents definitely said, "Oh, what do you think about? Don't even think about going there." But it was also, of course, like very scary. I was like, 16, 17. I was like, damn, I don't want to like go there because I mean, what can happen? They can beat you up,
risky for sure.
Yeah, and of course, and then was like, I mean, Russian politics, I guess, is not that linear, like in a way, because then Crimea happened, and there was a complete reversal, and there was complete and total wave of support for Putin's actions. I guess even like unprecedented. He became like 100% popular in Russia, like in every. Because, for example, I remember coming back to this Russian nationalism, and I think I would say I was a nationalist in the school, like, and I remember like nationalists were actually anti-Putin, just because they said, like, he doesn't protect Russian interests, and also like Russian population, so to speak, Russian speakers. He doesn't prioritize interests of Russian speakers, so to speak. And they were, for example, very dissatisfied with the Putin, but like once the Crimea happened, like all the nationalists became pro-Putin, so to speak. So he gained a lot of also like support from their side, and which is like very important. And his politics in Ukraine is based on this like nationalist support, which is a big chunk of the country, I think. At least like 30% of population in Russia, Russian speakers. I mean, they're of course most of them probably nationalists. I don't have good data, but like just talking to my parents and people who I know, they're definitely like nationalists. Even though they probably wouldn't conceptualize themselves, but by just communicating with them, you could see this.
This is something very interesting. I guess I'll go back in history a little bit here. But during Soviet times, Russian nationalism was viewed very negatively. So even going from Lenin said that Russians used to be the oppressor nation within the Russian Empire. So now they have to atone for their sins and help the other nations of the empire progress because they have been exploited. So Russian nationalism was very negatively looked upon during the Soviet period. Maybe during Stalin times it had a little bit of a revival, but for most of the Soviet history it was persecuted. So I wonder if maybe we're seeing this pendulum effect. You had many decades of Soviet rule that said Russian nationalism is bad, and now when you have this vent that you actually can be nationalist and it's actually encouraged, so it returns with strength, the swing of the pendulum. So
maybe, like in a sense, I think coming a little bit maybe ahead in the podcast, but I think this pendulum system, if it was somehow institutionalized, it's a system that's pretty useful to Russia and to Russian people, because I do think they like the whole system switches from liberalism to conservatism, and there are like the swings of pendulum. But I like with the nationalism, I need to think about it a little bit more deeply. I think in general, in Soviet period of time. But it's also interesting in Soviet period of time. Of course, there couldn't be like Russian nationalists because they were building an empire, and the one that's with the global outreach,
a supranational
empire, and that's why they didn't even have like the whole. They didn't even have a republic for Russians.
Yes,
republic
they didn't.
For Russians was the whole Soviet republic, so of Soviet people, so to say, with people of every, and like many leaders of Soviet empire, they weren't Russians, like neither Stalin nor Khrushchev, for example.
Exactly, Ukrainian and Georgian, and this is something that not many people, I guess, understand. I guess, especially in the West, people view the Soviet Union as Russia, but under a different brand, and that's a completely wrong understanding of the country. Russia, there was a Russian Socialist Republic within the Soviet Union, of course, but it was actually underprivileged in comparison to the legal rights, to different republics. Every single different Soviet republic had their own parliament, their own communist party, their own like local government, and the Russian didn't. It was subordinate to the Soviet government overall. So that's something interesting to keep in mind, I guess.
And it's still, that's why maybe it still lacks this national identity, or at least this national identity is not as crystallized as in Poland, for example. It's hard sometimes to connect just on this basis of nationalism to other Russian people, because it's not that well defined.
Yeah, this is Russian national identity right now is something super interesting. I also wanted to ask you about it because it mixes so many different things. You have a mixture of pride in the achievements of the Russian Empire. There's a mixture of pride of Soviet achievements. True. And in theory, these two systems are completely opposite and they can never exist together. But somehow modern Russian nationalism manages to blend the two of them and use them as a national identity. To me, it's super interesting.
I guess they're very modern people.
This is
like in a sense, modern people always mix stuff, but somehow in their theoretical understanding, they still draw boundaries. And you could also see it's so obvious in architecture, because sometimes like those new churches, like Church of, I guess, like Russian military, whatever they called it in English at least, it completely blends like, Soviet red stars with like, like Russian Christian symbols, which doesn't make any sense, like, And I mean, actually, like Stalin, of course, is an interesting figure in this regard, because the whole, like, when they started building Soviet Union, of course, there was no idea of the country that they wanted to build. Like, what are we building? Like in 20s, they didn't even teach students history of Russian history, or maybe just like world history, but not Russian history, because they didn't know what type of citizen, like what type of ideal citizen we are creating here in this country. And then, of course, Stalin came to power in 30s, or you can say fully maybe came to power in 30s. And that's the moment when Stalin realized that the best way to achieve this is like to come back to this idea of Russian Empire.
But he actually mostly did that during the war.
Yes, but in the war especially, also because you said, and I thought about the church, and he had an agreement with the Russian church that was allowed to come back, so to speak, on the basis of that it would endorse Stalin, so to speak. And like the modern Russian church still takes roots in the Stalinist church, which is also super interesting because I guess it's almost like, I don't know, it's almost like the state is its own kind of institution. And like even during Stalin assembling all those pieces of influence, so to speak, because of course church is a very big institution and it has a certain impact on Russian people. And I guess people believed still they were still Christian even during the Soviet Empire, but they couldn't really worship it. So it's really interesting, of course, but like the whole change of like, the swing of pendulum, as you said, for example, after. But what is interesting, for example, I just had this in my mind when you said about swing of the pendulum, is this, of course, idea that also Russian people don't understand or don't really process this, that like Russia had a civil war, for example.
Oh yeah, exactly.
And not so long ago, like less than 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Like imagine, and like vicious, officially from 18 to 24.
But some
vicious
fights were
6 year war.
carried on like late 20s.
Yeah, like and vicious one, like like massive killings, like
Yeah, more Russians died during the Russian Civil War than during
Yeah.
World War One. So
Yeah.
that says a lot.
That says a lot, and it's interesting. It's still in like Russian psyche. People just never discuss it.
Interesting.
But animosity around people is probably still there. Like there is still something. I mean, on a kind of like very micro level, there is something missing in society, and there is no like I mean, people can say it's civil, like a civil society. So just deep respect for people who live around you, because in Russia it feels like there is animosity towards people who you don't know, and they almost like oh fuck those people, like
Yeah.
almost everyone, like but you never understand this because I guess it's very unhealthy attitude, because those people, they compose the society, actually they compose the same type of community. So, and for me, from thinking like almost from a perspective of anarchy in Russia, I think this perspective of anarchy works really well, because you see the society where people don't agree on anything, and the type of authority that the society needs is the one of authoritarian in nature, so to speak, or like ultimate authority.
Yeah, you need to have someone who has the final say.
Yeah, because otherwise they're gonna just kill each other. And this is what again happened in 20s and during the Civil War, because they started just
Yeah, once central authority disappeared, shit hit the fan.
yeah, even though I mean, of course, like Bolsheviks, they lost elections, so to speak.
Yeah, this is actually something interesting that my history professor asked in class once, and she said like, "This is a question, and I don't have an answer. I'm asking you. Maybe you'll tell me because I can't understand that." The Russian Empire was so diverse before the revolution. You had millions of nationalist parties. You had socialists and like 10 different parties of socialists. You had the cadets, you had the SRs, you had the Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, so many parties. And many of them had way more support than the Bolsheviks. And how did this happen that this one very minor party with very little support managed to take over and build this massive empire?
Yeah.
It's a very interesting historical conundrum.
I guess they were very vicious.
Yeah.
And they just it's extremely interesting, I think so, yeah. And but they definitely made it, but also with violence, with a lot of violence, and
definitely
the formation of KGB. And I mean, they kind of like took the civil war seriously, and they quite clearly killed one part of Russian population entirely. Like you could also think about how many people left Russia, and brilliant people like writers, poets, scientists, like you name it. Like, and it's still, of course, it still has an impact, like a ripple effect on modern Russian society. And the same thing is happening now, when the big chunk of population, very smart population, like IT guys, like writers, poets, composers, they are leaving Russia en masse, so to speak. Of course, and it will also have like ripple effects on the current Russian society, because people who are staying, they having this like moral compromise with themselves. They're just saying, maybe I don't support Putin. I mean, it's kind of interesting. They could say, maybe I don't support Putin, I kind of support war, but I'm going to keep silent because there's nothing for me to do, so to speak.
Exactly. What can I do as a single person?
Yes, exactly. So, of course, this is like, I mean, Russia is an interesting country just to analyze and think about. And I guess the more you analyze, the more you kind of lose the whole understanding.
Yes, it's just so diverse. Even modern Russia, which is, I guess, in theory, supposed to be this like modern nation state, it still has millions of Muslims and different national minorities and people who believe in like tribal rituals. It's still like the remnants of the period where Russia was an empire, conquering and colonizing Siberia. It's still with it to this day, and it's still a very diverse country. And it's not, a modern nation state. We can speak of modern nation states like France, for example.
Yeah, true. But it also has this component of a very powerful state. And the state as an institution itself is almost like an imperial institution that is now super powerful. It's almost like what I try to think. Of course, there is in the West this understanding that, of course, there's some deep connection because people in parliament and like just regular citizens that live. And this connection is, they go to ballot and, they drop like those papers in the box. And this is the connection that you make. I mean, you can argue that, this connection is like very real and it's very serious. But you can also argue that this is like an illusion. Like, of course there is this connection. But I mean, do you really think that people who sit in the parliament and have like very deep connection to the people, so to speak, like just your regular neighbors, so to say?
Most likely not.
And like they do have, but this is like a very like illusionary connection, or in a sense, and who has the power to decide, so to speak? Because of course in the West there is this tradition to think, it's like the citizens decide something, like, but do they really decide something, or is it like all those elites that present those agendas to the population and they make it like with COVID, for example, right? It's not like population knew that it had to lock itself up in the apartment, but like they said, like, this is what we have to do, and it's your responsibility, by the way, to do it, and everyone had to do it eventually. I mean, so something like, but of course in Russia it's also like very obvious that the state is different type of society, and people in the state, they have no connection to people, like just regular people. That's why it's also interesting, the whole sanction regime, and when they target like, Russian people, what they don't understand, that like they don't have any connection to the people in power.
Yeah, I guess the understanding is that they're going to be pissed and, storm the Kremlin and kill Putin and introduce a democracy. I guess that's the understanding, which is, of course, wishful thinking. But that's, I guess, the idea.
Which is hubris, and it also runs into a lot of contradictions, because if they understand that Russia is like a dictatorship, how can dictatorship have like connection to Russian people? Like, because dictatorship implies that something like, was stolen from the people, like this type of power. It's based on suppression of any other opinion, so to speak.
I know.
And in Russia, it's pretty obvious. You cannot really go with even like empty sign to you cannot go to like the Red Square and have an empty sign. You're going to be arrested. You're going to be like
people even like pretended to be holding signs, but nothing.
Exactly.
They still got arrested.
This is exactly what's happening, and of course, there's no way to channel your dissatisfaction, because whatever you do, you're going to be beaten up and arrested, and or sent to front now, I guess.
It's hard to be dissident in Russia.
Yeah.
And but the sanctions, I guess I'll play a little bit of a devil's advocate here. I absolutely agree that sanctions will not topple Putin. But I think Western politicians had to introduce them, because imagine that you were a politician in Poland. You were up for re-election and you didn't introduce sanctions on Russia. You would lose the election immediately. I think you should introduce sanctions, but thinking carefully not to sanction Russian people, so to speak. Like the moves like to sanction like MasterCards and Visa, those moves like... I think it's impossible to target just the people in power, because authoritarian regimes have tremendous ability to redistribute the burden of the sanctions among society. So... I think it's pretty well proven in IR literature that sanctions against totalitarian or authoritarian regimes don't work, because these regimes can redistribute the burden, and they will redistribute the burden on the parts of population that don't support them anyway. It's pretty simple, if there are sanctions on importing food, for example, an authoritarian regime will take the smaller amount of food that they're able to import and just redistribute it among their supporters. But I mean, the sanction question, of course, is very interesting for me, and especially IR as a discipline, because I think there is a ton of practical evidence that sanctions just don't work. No, I mean, they don't. At least if you premise the idea on the basis that you sanction someone, like you sanction Putin, and either his regime will eventually collapse, or it won't collapse, but it will lose. They base like the whole concept on the idea that like Putin eventually will change his behavior, but like everyone understands from previous examples like Iran, North Korea, that it only amplifies his behavior, or it makes it even more confrontational, or it actually gives him opportunity to say, look at those people. They sanction not just me, but also they sanction you, which is just right. I mean, it's not like actually wrong way to say. So he gains even more support among Russian people. I mean, the whole, of course, and I guess actually, I might be wrong, but from international law perspective, the sanctions can only be made by the UN, by unanimous decision of the Security Council. That's what they did with North Korea, for example.
but they couldn't do it unilaterally. So they also kind of breaking international law. The sanction regime should be like international in its nature. But you know what I mean.
Yeah, I absolutely know what you mean. I also had this thought that it reinforces the narrative of Putin that he says, "Hey, look, these people are against you, the common Russian citizen." But actually, I've noticed a bit different thing happening in Poland right now, with the EU withholding money from Poland, and the entirety of anti-government opposition is like, good. It's good that we are sanctioned by the EU because our country is breaking the law. Of course, the supporters of the government are like, yeah, fuck the EU. But basically, every single voter of the opposition is like, yeah, it's great that we're getting sanctioned. It's amazing. So I guess it's a different understanding here. And I wonder where the difference comes from, that in North Korea, Iran, and Russia, people are like, yeah, screw the West. They're hurting us. And people are like, yeah, it's hurting me, but like our government deserved it. I wonder where's the difference?
I guess some type of nationalism again comes into play because it unifies Russian society around Putin, and I guess like the sanction regime after Crimea was they tried to make it very smart in terms of they tried to target specifically Putin and his inner circle, but not like Russian people, so very careful in avoiding targeting specific Russians. But then, of course, after like the war, I mean, it also, in a very long perspective, it just disunites people even more. Like, now you couldn't really go to Poland, for example, as what we discussed, so just to the EU. And of course, like...
here we are in Poland.
And here we are in Poland, just because I escaped Russia way back in the day, in 2018. Actually, like one of the reasons I left was I clearly saw that the situation going to get worse.
Well,
not gonna get
sadly,
better.
you were right.
Sadly, I was right. So now we have, of course, the war ongoing, but at least I'm not not in Russia, being on the front.
Yes. Yeah, and this also is an interesting question. We also asked this question before. What do the people on the front actually think? What do they feel like? What are their motivations? Are they... It's just we have no insight into this.
Yeah, but it's the biggest, if you think from historical perspective, it's the biggest event in Russian history since 91. Since the collapse of the Soviet
Absolutely,
Union.
this is the biggest one.
This is the biggest one, and that's why it has significant impact on Russian people and Russian psyche, and people who are doing this, especially in terms of like they're actually participating in world politics, are those people in the front. And Russia does have like this culture of glorification of war heroes. And it's just interesting to think, like, how do those people perceive the conflict? Why are they actually fighting for? I mean, of course, you can say yes, that they have no other choice, but I also think it's lame perspective because I don't believe that. I think 10, maybe like 25% of soldiers, they don't want to fight this war, but I think majority of soldiers are still fighting this war with some intention in their mind. So it's just interesting for me to just think about from Russian perspective as well. Of course, I understand Ukrainian perspective perfectly, and I guess it's way much easier to be Ukrainian now than to be Russian.
Yeah, they are fighting to basically save their nation.
Yeah, but I still think that the whole perspective also what made me think. Some people, of course, make an argument that there is a certain element of civil war in this conflict. Like in terms of like if you think about
Soviet Civil War,
Russian speakers living in Ukraine, and of course I thought but new civil war in Russia is also possible. Like in a sense, like imagine there are going to be people in Kaliningrad that are going to get so pissed. They say, let's fight those motherfuckers. Of course you need to have some complete change in their attitude to the authorities. But if Russian state gets really weak, it collapses. I could also see people in St. Petersburg we always wanted to be the EU. Fuck those guys. I would rather be part of Russian, Northern Republic than part of this stuff in the East, so to speak. And I remember one Russian intellectual put brilliantly. He said he hopes that in 50 years we wouldn't need visas to go to Siberia or whatever. They're going to be very sad.
Yeah,
if the whole country just falls apart. But of course, it's also interesting. It gives you perspective because whenever you have this consolidation of power, it also has this drawback of being a little bit fake. Because there is no real power on the local level, and everything can really fall apart rather quickly, as it happened during the Soviet period of time.
Yes, I think
Like, very
nobody
unexpected.
nobody
Nobody
expected
expected.
it, and basically overnight the country
Yes.
disappeared.
But of course, there was a period of like swing of the pendulum, as you said, like extreme liberalization. I mean, some people go so far as to argue, like in '86 or '7, like the Soviet Union became one of the most liberal countries in the world. Just in terms of you could print everything, there was no authority, supervising information. You could print everything. You can, issue whatever journals you wanted, and of course, people who study like culture, Soviet culture, late Soviet culture, it's a pretty interesting period to study.
Yeah.
There were all sorts of funky ideas going around, Nazi ideas, I don't know, Stalinist ideas, anti-Stalinist ideas, what have you. Everything.
Everything was there.
Everything was there, and in a sense, like the country it could not really maintain this tempo of liberalization because it didn't have this history of liberalism, so to speak. So it just broke because it was like too much pressure, so to speak. It was like very intense living in this moment, so to speak.
Yeah.
And of course, the money issue also was kind of important.
Yeah, the economy also wasn't doing that great. So I guess we already sort of touched upon the topic, but in what direction is Russian society going right now?
Yeah.
It's not static, it's going
No.
somewhere. So what is the end point of this journey?
I think now it's definitely going into this pro-Putin direction. And of course, as what we discussed in previous episodes, of course, the whole point of this war is to make sure that the country is going into this direction, because there is no way backwards. Because whoever comes into power, he has to choose clearly the Putin's path. Or in other words, he has to choose to either continue this war, even if there is some peace settlement or some ceasefire. He's probably going to choose to, to kind of like get a national, nationalist support, and then continue the war, for example. And there is no way, I don't see Russian authorities, concluding this war with either Americans or the West in general, or like, there's no way. There's only one solution, so to speak. There's only one way for Russian society now is to be anti-Western, and of course, there is some I would say almost like a path towards like a bigger conflict with the West, because if you think about they're drafting people, they're preparing massive mobilization, they're increasing number of soldiers, number of troops, and of course you think about, but like. You just try to think about, okay, but what will happen to this country like in 5-6 years? It'll probably be the same, but way much more aggressive, military capable, military aware, with the kind of knowledge of like, oh no, we know how to fight wars actually.
Yeah, with experience gained. Yes,
no one else does. I mean, only Americans do, but no other nation can fight bigger wars in the modern era. And where does it lead us, so to speak?
It's a great unknown.
It's a great unknown. And of course, like Putin obsession with the war, because sometimes you hear him saying like, the West always wants to conquer us. So if you think about if he can make a move where the West moves on Russia first, maybe what we discussed, like, for example, they use nukes in Ukraine, or they try to conquer Baltics, or they use something in Baltics. And then like the West responds, and then like Putin can use it as the whole narrative. They are again attacking us.
Yeah, the second great patriotic war.
Yeah, and I think it will definitely gain all the support.
Yeah, I believe that.
Yeah, but it's also what's surprising is to think that they still maintain like they are fighting like a big European war, but at the same time they maintain society or they maintain economy.
Yeah,
and
it keeps running.
It keeps running, and it doesn't slow down. It's still a big economy, and it's still in a good shape, I would say, more or less. And this is of course
it's interesting how
scary.
long it can last.
Yeah, and also where this country is going. Like, where will it be in 5 years? Like, and of course, it won't be that different. Even if there is going to be another guy in power.
Yeah,
it
will be hard to move away from the path that Putin has chosen. So. Here we are. But let's. We can also discuss, of course, like the longer arc of Russian history in terms of where is it going. I think
But there will be a moment in Russian history in the future where, let's say, there will be some reaction to the Putin's regime, to the Putin's authority, and this reaction probably going to be some democratic one, or like this.
How long do you think we'll have to wait to see that?
I mean, I think even Putin's successor will be type of Democrat, or they will be. If you think about like. Okay, when Stalin died in 53, so to speak, the system still survived for more than like 30 years. And, after Stalin, there was a period of type of Soviet liberalization, for example.
Oh, yeah,
with
certainly.
Khrushchev and stuff. So I think this is probably where like Russian society is going, so to speak. Even if Putin steps down, like the guy who comes into power going to have some liberalization going on.
But still keep the general path.
Keep the general path of confrontational path, probably.
Yeah, I think that's pretty plausible.
Very plausible. Yeah.
We'll live to see, I guess.
Yes, I hope so.
I hope so, yes.
Especially
that's a good summary.
We are not, I don't know, get into the front in new European war.
Well, we're currently in a NATO frontline state.
NATO frontline state. Yeah, and I could see the Polish preparation for something big happening.
Dude, like 5% of GDP for armament.
Makes sense. They will be.
And the Americans must be ecstatic.
I guess they are. I mean, finally, the West they reinvigorated the idea of the West.
Yes, they certainly did. It was brain dead, as Macron said.
It was brain dead.
Which I guess shows that the idea of the West is reinforced by the opponent, by the other, being the East.
By the other, and by American leadership also. In both good and positive, I guess, way. Yeah, so any other questions?
I guess that's it with my questions, unless you have something to add that you still have on
maybe
your heart.
let's maybe talk about your experience with Russia. I mean, I know that you have never visited Russia.
Never, even though I've been planning to.
I hope you will one day. But let's maybe, how did you get interested? For how long have you been studying Russian, by the way?
So my first contact with the language, it's kind of silly, but it was in middle school, and I was just bored during math class, and my classmate with whom I sat at the desk, he was from Belarus.
Oh,
and
what was his name?
Mitya.
Mitya is like a Dmitry.
Yeah, it's short for Dmitry, yes. Yeah. And I was like, yo, dude, teach me some Russian. Like, this math is boring. Teach me some Russian. He was like, yo, man, sure, like, check this out. This is how I would write your name in Cyrillic. I was like, whoa, it's so cool. So he first taught me the Cyrillic alphabet. And I remember I would, when I learned the Cyrillic alphabet, he and we would prepare, I don't know what's the word for it in English, in Polish called ściąga. It is something that you prepare to cheat on the exam. So
Szpargalka.
Yeah, something like that, yeah. So what we would do is we would write our notes for a class, for an exam in Russian, so like in Cyrillic. And if the teacher like caught us, it would be, oh no, it's just my Russian notes, like the teacher couldn't read it. So we're like, oh no, it's just my Russian notes. And the teacher would be like, oh yeah, okay, sure, whatever.
Oh, that's so smart.
I know.
And I guess it's a good way to learn the language.
Yeah, I mean, I remember this was like my first contact with the language. And then, again, a silly thing, I was like, 13? I read the Metro books by Glukhovsky. I was like, wow, like, this is like the entire, like this huge metro system is so cool. And I started reading about Moscow and its history. And I really got interested in Russian history this way. And I started learning Russian, I suppose, like taking classes when I was like 15, something like this. I took classes for like 1 year. Then I stopped and I only like learned by myself from time to time. And then I got started again when I started university. And what got me super interested in this history is the fact that I knew almost nothing about it. In school, I wasn't taught almost anything. The only thing that I learned from school was basically Russia bad, Poland good.
Yeah, that's what we do.
Yeah, that's basically what we learn. I will learn about every single uprising against Russian occupation. I will learn again about every single partisan movement that fought against the communists, about every single politician who was in opposition to the communists, and that's the lens through which I learned Russian history. And when I discovered there's so much more to it, I was like, "Whoa, that's so interesting."
Yeah.
And I still think this way because I obviously believe that Russia is the bad guy here starting a war, but I still think that people in the West, even in Poland, like they don't understand this country so much.
Yeah.
The only thing in this category, like, yeah, Russia bad.
Yeah.
But it's so much more. It's so many different groups, so many different nationalities, so many different regions with very interesting histories, and even what we discussed, equating Russia to the Soviet Union. This is just purely wrong. And I can assure you that 99% of people in the West are making this assumption that Soviet Union equals Russia,
Probably.
and it's just purely wrong. And I just really enjoy uncovering all the different fun facts and fascinating stories that there are in Russian history, and also amazing achievements, because there were many, which are in Poland and in the West, they're ignored or basically forgotten.
So what's your favorite fun fact?
Favorite fun fact? Oh, dude. I guess maybe not the favorite, but one that I learned recently while writing my BA thesis was that when the Americans were spying on the Soviet Union during the Cold War, they used hot air balloons and they installed cameras on the hot air balloons, and they just deployed it over the Soviet Union. And the Soviets shot down so many of these balloons, and they recovered so many of them, including photographic film. And the photographic film that they used was radiation resistant because the balloons flew so high, it was close to the edge of the atmosphere, where cosmic radiation was a thing. And Soviets at the time, they could not develop a radiation-resistant film, so they could not take pictures in space. And the Americans provided them this film basically for free, trying to spy on them. And then the Russians just took the American film, installed it on their own spaceships, and sent them to space. So the first pictures ever taken of the far side of the moon, taken by the Luna 3 Soviet space probe, they were taken by a Soviet space probe using American film that they captured from American spy balloons.
That's very nuanced.
I know, right? That's just the first thing that comes to my mind. Like a very interesting fun fact.
Yeah. Yeah, Soviet history is pretty interesting.
It's super interesting, and I think, of course, like Soviet Union was, I guess, in many ways an evil system and murdered many millions of people. But there's more to it. People only see it through this lens, but there's way more to it. It's a country that lasted a few decades. So.
Yeah. But I guess there was, I mean, I could maybe share my experience from studies at MGIMO. And MGIMO was basically the school founded in 1944, so just during the war, so to speak, the Second World War. And its design was to basically make Russian diplomats, like prepare outstanding people who can go abroad. But you need to understand that those people who they trust to go abroad, they should be 100% loyal. So they designed this whole school in such a like cruel military way, when like learning languages like at MGIMO means to suffer. Like, you know, just, and then you can sense something weirdly like, you know, this like kind of respect for authority when you never ask questions. Like in a sense, like you just couldn't ask those questions because there's no point in asking questions, because there should be just this like unanimous respect for the authority, so to speak. Which, yeah, once I realized that, I was like, that's not what I wanted.
Yeah, makes sense.
That's not what I wanted. So, but yes, it's a very incredible. Definitely. I mean, I'm not a big fan of Soviet history, but I think, of course, it can be very interesting.
I think it's just misunderstood, I guess. And Russian imperial history is also misunderstood. Russia being viewed as the singular entity for ethnic Russians, which is also not entirely true. It was so diverse, and so many different regions were governed so differently. Like, for example, you had the Duchy of Finland, which was essentially independent,
Yeah.
just with the Tsar being the Duke of Finland.
And the Polish constitution.
Yeah, and the Polish constitution, which was super liberal.
It
Actually,
didn't last long, I know.
actually, but the Finnish autonomy lasted quite long.
Yeah.
And actually, not many people know, but when you look at maps of Europe from before World War One, Finland is being depicted as part of Russia, just but Finland was essentially independent at the time. Many, for example, revolutionaries who were wanted by the Tsarist police, they would just escape to Finland, which was de facto part of the Russian Empire, but the Russian police could not arrest them there because it was technically a different state. And not many people know that, how different the Novosibirsk Empire was.
But people who governed Russian Empire, they were Germans.
Oh yeah, certainly.
It's actually interesting. Whoever kind of runs Russia, they tend to be some foreign entity, which is interesting. It certainly makes sense if you conceptualize the state as a different type of society.
Going back to the Vikings, by the way.
Going back to the Vikings, yeah, and especially during Russian Empire, it was pretty obvious. All Tsars, they were basically Germans, and maybe Nicholas II was half British. I guess he had a British brother.
Yeah.
I mean. Interesting though, but it's. I mean, I do enjoy reading about Russian history.
Oh yeah, that makes two of us.
Yes, because I mean, this period of history, Russian history, especially 19th century, is very European, and I mean, you could say the country was on the path to it was on the same path as other Western empires. Mm-hmm. In a sense, but then something drastic happened.
Something changed, yes.
This drastic was this desire to become better part of the West. But it's also interesting. We can come back to this. Do you think? I need to ask you. Do you think Russia is the West or non-West?
I am a huge fan of listening to self-identification, and currently Russia self-identifies as definitely not the West.
Do you think so?
I think that they are very clearly making it clear that they are not the West.
I think they're trying to say that they're better West. I mean, they're Christian, and they emphasize that they're Christian, and Christianity is the West.
Yeah, it's very intertwined with Western ideals. Yeah.
Well, because they're saying those ideas about gender and gays, it's not real West. It's it's deviation.
Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting perspective. I mean, and it sort of fits with the narrative, for example, of Peter the Great, who made Russia Western.
Yeah, but people who deny actually Russian Westerners are actually Americans. Because for them, if you again think Americans are at the forefront of constructing Western identity, for them it's important to say those people are not the West. And they're trying to reiterate it and emphasize it every time they can, that Russia is something separate, it's not part of the West. That's what, I mean, I think it's appealing to me at least to think so. Because I think Russia definitely conceptualizes itself as just better West. It's
that's certainly true.
I'm trying to say we are this type of the West with this gender norms is the wrong West. The one with the family values. And the same thing goes about in a sense, Putin was one of the first guys who championed this idea, and for example, Trump just took it.
Yeah.
Or built on the same principles, so to speak.
Okay, that's a convincing point. I agree.
Great. Yes, for me, and coming back to this revolution, 1917, and of course, you think about the country was developing, Russian Empire was developing as a regular, modern kind of European state, imperial state. But then suddenly they decided, we want to take those Western ideas, which is of course ideas about communism are Western. And said,
certainly.
Let's implement those ideas, just implement them. Those people talking about communism, we're gonna make communism.
We're gonna make it, exactly.
Which is super interesting, because I don't know how you can think that the country that attempted to implement communism is not Western, because those ideas are deeply scientific. Because if you think about what they wanted to build, is the most scientific, accurate society.
That's where Marxist legitimacy came from science.
Yeah, eliminating poverty, making everyone happy scientifically. I mean, implementation is a different story, because I guess implementation got boggled down with this Russian imperial past and Russian traditions and stuff like this. But the ideal was there.
And it was very Western.
Very Western.
Straight from Germany.
Straight from Germany. That's why I actually think for Russia it's also possible to like to make this weird comeback when Russia in the future going to say, hey, let's take like the most brilliant new Western ideas that are denied actively by, let's say, people in the West. Let's try to implement them. I mean, I actually think I would love to return to this country that's implementing the most radical Western ideas.
I would love to visit.
Yeah, maybe one day, maybe 50
Hopefully.
years, 100 years.
Hopefully
Who knows?
we'll still live.
Hopefully we're still alive, yeah.
Exactly.
And we witness changes. And
Fingers
hopefully,
crossed.
yeah, there is no other civil war.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. So I guess summing up the episode, I would say that, I mean, actually Russian people also don't understand Russia quite well. It's hard.
I believe that. It's hard to understand.
It's hard to understand.
There's too many factors to consider.
And just from my personal perspective, I guess I am the guy who read quite a lot in Russian history, and I try to understand it, but after a while you realize the more you read, the more opaque the whole concept of Russia becomes for you, because I guess it changes so quickly and so often, and then it almost like grows and expands. It acquires, as for example with the modern Russia, it's like basically the mixture of Soviet Union with Russian Empire, which are completely irreconcilable, as you may think, irreconcilable ideas, but suddenly,
and yet it works.
Suddenly they blended them together. Again, this is like a very maybe modern move.
It is mishmash and fusion.
Mishmash. So, hope to discuss with you Russia again in the next episode.
A pleasure as always.
Not the next one, but some next.
In the future for sure.
Next year.
Next year, exactly.
Recorded on the New Year's Eve, almost.
Almost, exactly. So Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, and yeah, stay healthy, I guess.
We'll see you in the future.
Bye.